All right, let's dive into this chapter you sent over. It's a pretty fascinating look at all these nutrient cycles, like carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and others. It even gets into how they're all connected, especially with the little guys running the show, the microorganisms. So our mission, if we choose to accept it, is to really break down this whole big picture for everyone and uncover some of the surprising details about how these cycles actually work, and also, of course, how us humans are messing with them. We're going to go through it all piece by piece.
Yeah, this chapter is like a foundational guide to how our planet keeps ticking. And it's crazy how much of it really comes down to these microbes we can't even see.
Right. So we're going to start with, with how carbon moves through everything. The atmosphere, land, the oceans, the whole shebang. We'll be looking at the roles of photosynthesis and decomposition.
Hmm.
And did you know that it's actually microbes that are the single biggest natural source of CO2 release?
It's true.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And then we'll also get into this interesting world of methane hydrates and how they could impact climate change. Oh, speaking of climate change, we'll also be tackling the nitrogen cycle, that whole complex web of fixation, denitrification, and all that jazz.
Yeah.
We'll be figuring out why it's so important for life itself and how we humans are changing it, sometimes in ways that backfire on us, like in our soils and oceans. And then we'll get to the sulfur cycle with its star, hydrogen sulfide, that lovely rotten egg smell, courtesy of some pretty tough bacteria. We'll even touch on how a tiny sulfur compound made in the oceans can actually influence cloud formation.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty neat, huh?
Very cool.
And beyond just those big three, we'll also explore the cycles of iron, manganese, phosphorus, calcium, and silicon. We're going to uncover some surprising things that microbes can do, like long-range electron transfer, which is basically bacteria with nanowires.
Oh.
And we'll see how these cycles are vital for marine life, from diatoms to coral reefs. And of course, we can't forget about the human impact. We'll look at rising CO2 levels, ocean acidification, and the massive changes we're making to the nitrogen cycle. We'll even touch on how microbes deal with toxic mercury.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. But think of this like your own guided tour through Earth's life support systems, with a special focus on those unsung heroes, microorganisms.
Absolutely.
So are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. So the chapter starts by talking about these massive carbon reservoirs. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is the sheer scale of it, right? I mean, most of the carbon is locked up in the Earth's crust as rocks and sediments. But here's the thing, that carbon is basically stuck there on human timescales.
Yeah, so it's not really a factor in our immediate climate worries.
Exactly. So we need to look at the more active parts of the carbon cycle.
Right, so what are those?
We're talking about things like land plants, all that dead organic matter we call humus, and of course the oceans. They're the big players when it comes to the carbon cycle and how it impacts us today.
The active players? Okay, I get it. So the chapter, it really emphasizes how quickly carbon can actually zip through the atmosphere as CO2.
It does.
And it gets pulled out by photosynthesis, not just by trees, but also by a whole bunch of microscopic marine organisms. Then it's put back through respiration and, importantly, microbial decomposition. So it's kind of funny, right? We always think of forests as these big CO2 vacuums, but
the microbes are constantly putting a lot of it back in.
yeah, exactly. It's like they're playing a constant game of carbon tag.
It's a natural balance.
Right, a natural balance.
Yeah.
But as the chapter says, we humans have kind of messed that balance up a bit, by adding all this extra carbon into the atmosphere.
Definitely. I mean, burning fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution has increased atmospheric CO2 by nearly 40%. And, well, we're seeing those consequences now with global warming.
Yeah, for sure. So let's break down the processes a bit more. Photosynthesis and decomposition are kind of like two sides of the same coin, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Like one takes the carbon out, the other puts it back in.
Exactly. Photosynthesis, whether it's happening in a leaf or a tiny bacterium, is all about using energy, usually sunlight, to turn CO2 and water into organic compounds and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Respiration is basically the reverse. It breaks down those compounds to get energy, producing CO2 and water in the process.
Makes sense.
The chapter makes a good point here. For organic matter to actually build up, like over a long time, photosynthesis has to be faster than respiration.
Right. So if they were always in perfect balance, we wouldn't have things like coal or oil forming over millions of years.
Right. It's all about that accumulation.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, the chapter also talks about methane, CH4, and these things called methane hydrates. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, even if it doesn't stick around as long.
Oh, yeah. It's a powerful one.
Right. So what's the deal with these hydrates?
Well, in environments without oxygen, what we call anoxic environments, certain microorganisms called methanogens actually produce methane as a byproduct of their metabolism. And over vast periods, huge amounts of this methane, all that past microbial activity, has gotten trapped in permafrost and marine sediments. And that's where you get methane hydrates.
So it's like frozen methane, like ice that burns.
Basically, yeah. But here's the problem. These hydrates are very sensitive to changes in temperature and pressure.
Oh, no.
Yeah. As the planet warms, there's a real concern that they could become unstable. If that happens, they would release all that methane into the atmosphere.
That wouldn't be good.
No, not at all. It could dramatically accelerate climate change. It's a potential feedback loop and a pretty worrying one, as the chapter emphasizes.
A feedback loop. So the more it warms, the more methane gets released, which warms it even more.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay, that's a lot to take in on the carbon cycle front. But we're just getting started. Let's move on to another crucial element, nitrogen.
All right, nitrogen.
The chapter makes it sound incredibly complex, but it's clearly essential for all life.
Oh, it is. Nitrogen is a key part of proteins and nucleic acids. You can't have life without it. But here's the thing. Most organisms can't use nitrogen in its most abundant form, which is nitrogen gas. You know, N2, the stuff that makes up most of our atmosphere.
So all that nitrogen is just floating around totally useless?
Well, not totally useless, but it needs to be fixed.
Fixed.
Yeah, converted into more reactive forms that organisms can actually use.
Right, and that's where nitrogen fixation comes in, right?
You got it. Certain bacteria and archaea have this amazing ability to take that atmospheric N2 and convert it into ammonia, NH3.
It's like they're unlocking nitrogen from the air for everyone else to use.
Precisely. And then you have denitrification, which is kind of the opposite process. In environments without oxygen, other microbes can turn nitrite back into nitrogen gas.
So they're putting it back into the air.
Yep. And that can actually be a problem in certain situations, like fertilized soils that are waterlogged.
So, too much of a good thing.
Yeah, sort of. But denitrification is really useful in wastewater treatment. It helps remove excess nitrogen.
Oh, interesting. So it's like good in some places, bad in others.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that one of the byproducts of denitrification, nitrous oxide, N2O, is actually another potent greenhouse gas.
Oh, great. More greenhouse gases.
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind.
So nitrogen has a lot of climate implications.
It really does. It's a complex cycle with lots of twists and turns.
Okay, the chapter also mentions ammonification. What is that all about?
Ammonification is basically just the process of ammonia being released when organic nitrogen compounds break down, like when a plant or animal dies and decomposes.
Right, so it's part of the decomposition process.
Exactly.
And then there's nitrification, which is a two-step process, right?
Well, it used to be considered a two-step process, but then we discovered these Chamaemox bacteria.
Chamaemox, that sounds made up.
I know, right? But they're real. And they've changed our understanding of nitrification. You see, we used to think that first some bacteria would oxidize ammonia to nitrite, and then another group would oxidize that nitrite to nitrate.
Right, two steps.
But these Chamaemox bacteria, like some species of Nitrospira, can do the whole thing themselves.
Wow.
Overachievers. And the chapter points out that nitrification can be a bit of a problem in agriculture because it can convert ammonium fertilizers into nitrate, which is more soluble and can be lost more easily.
So our fertilizers are less effective.
Yeah, it can be an issue.
Okay, and the last stop on the nitrogen train is anamics. Anaerobic ammonium oxidation. That sounds pretty specialized.
It is. It happens in environments without oxygen. Basically, ammonia is oxidized using nitrite as an electron acceptor.
Electron acceptor.
Yeah, it's getting a bit technical, but basically it's a way for the bacteria to get energy.
Right.
And the end product of anamics is nitrogen gas. So it's another way that fixed nitrogen can be removed from the environment.
Okay, so we've covered carbon and nitrogen. What's next?
Sulfur.
Sulfur, the stinky element.
That's the one. And it's a versatile one, too. Sulfur has a lot of different oxidation states, which means it can exist in a ton of different forms.
Okay, remind me what oxidation state means again?
Think of it like a way to track how many electrons an atom has gained or lost.
Okay, that makes sense.
So sulfur can go from sulfide with the NH2 oxidation state to elemental sulfur at 0 and all the way up to sulfate at +6. And all these different forms of sulfur play a role in the sulfur cycle.
So it's like sulfur is wearing different hats depending on what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
All right, let's talk about the most famous sulfur compound. Hydrogen sulfide, or H2S, that lovely rotten egg smell. The chapter says it's produced by bacteria in environments without oxygen.
It is. Sulfate-reducing bacteria are the culprits. They basically breathe sulfate instead of oxygen to get energy, and hydrogen sulfide is their waste product.
Their exhaust fumes.
You got it. And it's not just stinky, it's also toxic. It interferes with respiration in other organisms, and it's often why anoxic sediments turn black.
Why is that?
It reacts with iron to form insoluble iron sulfides.
So that's why the mud stinks, and it's black.
That's the reason.
Okay, but the chapter also talks about sulfide and elemental sulfur being oxidized. How does that work? If there's no oxygen, how can they be oxidized?
Well, if there is oxygen present, sulfide will oxidize spontaneously. But even in environments without oxygen, there are sulfur-oxidizing bacteria that can do the job. They use other compounds as electron acceptors.
So they're like the cleanup crew for sulfur.
You could say that.
Okay, and then there are organic sulfur compounds. The chapter focuses on dimethyl sulfide, or DMS.
DMS is an interesting one. It's produced in marine environments.
I remember reading something about DMS in clouds.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating connection. When DMS is released into the atmosphere, it can actually promote cloud formation.
So tiny ocean microbes could be influencing the weather?
It's possible. More clouds mean more sunlight is reflected back into space, which can have a cooling effect on the planet.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. Okay, you've covered the big three: carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur.
We have.
So what's next?
Now we move on to some other important elements: iron and manganese. And they both have some interesting redox chemistry going on.
Redox.
Yeah, it means they can easily switch between different oxidation states. You remember those, right? Gaining or losing electrons.
Right. Like sulfur with its different hats.
Exactly. So iron exists as ferrous iron, F2 plus Sal, and ferric iron, S3 plus Go. Manganese is found as Mn2 plus and Mn4 plus IPE.
Okay, so lots of different forms. But what's the big deal with iron and manganese?
Well, the key difference is solubility. The reduced forms, F2 plus and Mn2 plus, stay dissolved in water. But the oxidized forms, FeOH3 and MnO2, are insoluble.
So they sink to the bottom.
Exactly. And they often act as electron acceptors in anoxic sediments.
Electron acceptors again. So what does that mean for the microbes?
It means they can use these iron and manganese oxides to get energy.
Like they're breathing them.
You could say that. They're using them to help break down organic matter.
Okay, and this is where we get into some really cool stuff like long-range electron transfer, bacteria with nanowires.
It's amazing, right? Imagine a bacterium in the sediment trying to get energy from insoluble F3 plus that's far away.
It sounds impossible.
Right. But some bacteria have found a way, like Geobacter. They use electrically conductive pili, which are basically biological nanowires.
Nanowires.
Yeah.
Like actual wire.
Yep. And they use these wires, along with special proteins called cytochromes, to create an electrical connection to the iron oxides.
It's like they built their own power grid.
It is. And then there's Schwanella. They use cytochrome-rich extensions of their outer membrane. It's a different strategy, but the end result is the same. They can access electrons from far away.
Incredible. And then the chapter talks about extracellular electron shuttles. What are those?
Think of them like tiny delivery trucks for electrons. Some bacteria produce these small molecules that can pick up electrons from the microbe and then deliver them to the insoluble metal oxides.
So they act like intermediaries.
Yeah, exactly. They shuttle electrons back and forth.
Okay. And what are the other side of things? The oxidation of iron and manganese?
Well, F2 plus will oxidize spontaneously in the presence of oxygen, but there are also iron-oxidizing bacteria that can speed up the process.
Even in acidic environments.
Especially in acidic environments. Acidophiles, like AcidothioBacillus ferroxidans, thrive in those conditions. And there are also neutrophilic iron oxidizers that live in zones where oxygen-poor water mixes with oxygenated water.
So they like are right on the edge.
They do. And some anaerobic microbes can even use F2 plus as an electron donor while reducing nitrate. It's all about finding a way to get energy.
Microbes are so resourceful.
They are.
Okay, on to phosphorus, calcium, and silicon. The chapter says these are really important in aquatic environments.
They are. Phosphorus is a bit of a shapeshifter. It exists in both organic and inorganic forms. And it cycles through organisms, water, soil, and the Earth's crust.
Oh, it gets around.
It does. And the chapter highlights phosphonates, which are organophosphate compounds. They make up a big chunk of organic phosphorus in the oceans.
And some microbes can even break those down, right?
They can, and when they do, they release methane.
Methane. So that ties back into the carbon cycle.
It does.
It's all connected.
It is.
Okay, what about calcium? I always think of bones and shells when I hear calcium.
Well, you're not wrong. Calcium is essential for those things. But the biggest reservoirs of calcium are in rocks and dissolved in the oceans. And marine organisms like coccolithophores and foraminifera are key players in the calcium cycle.
Why is that?
They use calcium to build their shells and skeletons, and that process, called calcification, actually influences how much CO2 the oceans can absorb.
So they're helping regulate the climate.
In a way, yes. But here's the problem. Ocean acidification makes it harder for these organisms to build their shells.
Oh no, another consequence of all that extra CO2.
I'm afraid so.
Okay, last but not least, silicon. Those diatoms need that, right?
Right. Diatoms and other organisms like radiolarians use silicon to build their intricate structures. And diatoms are super important phytoplankton. They form the base of a lot of marine food webs.
So they're like the grass of the ocean.
You could say that. But they need silicon to grow. And if silicon becomes depleted, it can limit their growth, which in turn affects how much CO2 the oceans can absorb.
Right, so even silicon is tied into the climate.
It is. It all comes back to that.
Okay, the final part of the chapter is all about us humans and how we're messing with these nutrient cycles.
It's not a pretty picture.
We've already talked about the CO2 problem and ocean acidification, but the chapter starts with mercury transformations, which isn't exactly a nutrient, but microbes play a role in its toxicity.
They do. Mercury enters aquatic environments mostly as mercuric ion, Hg2 plus Wa. But in anoxic sediments, certain microbes can transform it into methylmercury.
And methylmercury is bad news.
Right. Very bad news. It's a potent neurotoxin, and it bioaccumulates in food chains, meaning it gets more concentrated as you go up the food web. So top predators end up with the highest levels.
That's scary. So the microbes are making mercury even more dangerous?
Unintentionally, yes. But the chapter also talks about mercury resistance in some bacteria.
There's hope.
Maybe. Some bacteria have enzymes that can actually detoxify mercury. They can break down methylmercury into less harmful forms.
Wow, so they've evolved ways to deal with this pollution.
They have. It's a reminder that life is incredibly adaptable.
That's true. Okay, so the chapter wraps up by looking at our impact on the carbon and nitrogen cycles.
Our impact has been huge, especially since the Industrial Revolution. We've already talked about the increase in atmospheric CO2, but the chapter reminds us that CO2 isn't the only greenhouse gas.
Right, there's also methane and nitrous oxide.
Exactly. And all of these gases contribute to global warming.
And it's not just the atmosphere that's changing. The oceans are absorbing a lot of that extra CO2, leading to ocean acidification.
Yeah.
How does that affect microbes?
It affects them in a few ways. First, it makes it harder for calcifying organisms to build their shells, and warmer ocean waters can become more stratified, which can slow down the transfer of nutrients to microbes. And that can potentially reduce overall ocean productivity.
So less food for everyone.
Potentially, yes. And ocean warming also contributes to the expansion of oxygen minimum zones.
And those are bad for marine life, right?
They can be. They can lead to changes in microbial processes like denitrification, which can actually increase the production of nitrous oxide.
Oh, right, that other greenhouse gas.
Yep.
So it's all a domino effect. Changes in one cycle affect all the others.
Exactly. It's all interconnected.
And the chapter also talks about how we're messing with the methane cycle. Wetlands, melting permafrost, livestock, rice cultivation, it's all adding up.
It is. And as the planet warms, these feedback loops become even more important. For example, thawing permafrost releases even more methane and CO2, and the loss of Arctic sea ice reduces the planet's reflectivity, which leads to even more warming in that region.
So it's like we're kicking the planet while it's down.
Yeah, kind of.
And then there's nitrogen. We've basically doubled the amount of reactive nitrogen in the biosphere,
We have, mostly through the production of nitrogen fertilizers.
which has allowed us to grow a lot more food.
It has. But it's also caused some problems. A lot of that nitrogen ends up in waterways, causing eutrophication.
Which is bad for water quality, right?
It is. It can lead to algal blooms and oxygen depletion, and some of that nitrogen is also lost to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide.
So it's a mixed bag. More food, but also more pollution.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that all these human-driven changes to the carbon and nitrogen cycles are intertwined. They can have far-reaching effects on the whole planet.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of these intricate nutrient cycles that keep our planet running, and how important those tiny microorganisms are, from fixing nitrogen to cycling carbon and even dealing with things like mercury.
It's amazing how much they do. And we've really gone through everything in this chapter, the vast scale of these cycles, the carbon in the Earth's crust, the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and the role of the oceans. It's incredible how human activity is now a major force in these natural processes. And sometimes, well, we don't even fully understand the consequences.
Yeah. Think about something as simple as photosynthesis and decomposition. Those are the building blocks of the carbon cycle, and microbes are essential for both. And the nitrogen cycle, with all its different forms and specialized bacteria. And the sulfur cycle. Who knew that tiny ocean creatures could help form clouds and cool the planet?
We talked about all that. And then there's iron and manganese with those amazing bacteria that use nanowires to transfer electrons. And how all these cycles are connected, it really shows how delicate the balance of Earth's systems is.
And of course, we can't forget about our impact. We're increasing greenhouse gases, overloading the nitrogen cycle, and changing the planet in ways we're only beginning to understand.
We covered all that, as laid out in the chapter. It raises an important question, something for everyone listening to think about. Given how much influence microbes have on these global cycles, what role should microbial research play in tackling environmental challenges, like climate change and pollution? It's a big question, and this deep dive was just the beginning. Hopefully it sparked your curiosity to keep learning.
Absolutely. There's a whole world of microbial activity out there silently shaping our planet.
And the more we learn about it, the better equipped we'll be to make sure that world keeps thriving.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, until next time, stay curious.